Deadpool and Wolverine is the latest installment of the X-Men franchise, so it's time to rank them all from my least favorite to my favorite. Welcome to Cinema, where we focus on film. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the X-Men franchise from your least favorite to your favorite. Let's all join in this nice, lovely discussion down in the comments below. Like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you wish, and it will help support this channel as we grow and build a film-loving community as a whole. Be respectful down in the comments below because we all have our own hot takes, our own rankings that we all look at films in different ways. But going in last place, we have The Dark Phoenix, one that particularly does not sit well with me since I first watched it out in theaters, and it just does not have the right formula for a Jean Grey origin story or even a solo film where it just feels muddled down by all of the other X-Men. And while it takes an interesting and darker approach to Charles Xavier, what you're going in with the director, it's intriguing by the nature of what they're doing with it, but ultimately fails to really hone in on its craft and create proper development for his character to transition from what appears to be a bad guy to appearing to be a good guy, and how that goes along with all of the villains that persuade Jean Grey into her true form. It just feels underwhelming by the character that you get from the villains, and trying to create a lead villain that is just as much the same as all of the other minion type villains. And so how that's developed, well, you do get some cool scenes here and there. It's just ultimately one that I often forget, doesn't feel like it has a proper place in the franchise, and so some of the emotional tides of the moment just get underdeveloped and not having the great impact that I would expect. And at number 13, we have X-Men Apocalypse. Now, this one is just one of the more boring ones for the franchise. It isn't particularly bad as a whole, but it's convoluted by this nature of Apocalypse trying to gather the 4 disciples to his nation, and also having the X-Men develop their own side, while also just the way that story flows about creates a long-winded way to get the disciples, but then it's great and badly developed for the nature of how that ultimately impacts the final battle, that they don't stick true to their nature of following Apocalypse. So there's no clear motivations behind all of these characters. It's very loosely based, which is horribly done for what should be this really well-determined villain. And so how that also develops the good guys along the way doesn't create the higher stakes that really should be built upon them, and how we get some of their characters in the past, but not building too much more, because this is now post Days of Future Past, where we're not getting the same sort of characters we got before, and so we're sort of retreading on some story arcs that are new to the nature of the story, and just doesn't recover from trying to build on this new world after they find the inconsistencies, and contrivances that have broken some of the X-Men franchise before this. And at number 12, we have the New Mutants, one that has an odd place within the franchise because it almost doesn't follow along the same rules or any of the same characters, and it's a neat coming-of-age story that isn't impressive by its CGI effects or how it establishes some of its characters or even its villains as well. It is harmless by the nature. It's not necessarily boring for me, but it isn't one that I try and go back to. It isn't one I think about often, but when I did rewatch this for this ranking, it was fine for what it's offering, and the coming-of-age aspect might be the most compelling thing that this film has to offer, at least with these teenagers just trying to get to know each other, trying to learn their powers, as well as discovering the mystery of the place they have been confined in. And at number 11, we have X-Men The Last Stand. Now, this has some great moments, but it also has some sour moments, some certain underdeveloped characters, and it's a Jean Grey Phoenix story that sort of undermines the stakes of what was given for Jean Grey's death in the just the movie before. And so how that all uncovers itself just isn't as grand within the way that it develops its stakes, and how it also has some different side stories along the way, tries to develop multiple different subplots, and also develop this villain team, and certain characters having ridiculous outfits that just doesn't vibe well with how you're viewing the story as a whole. Just creates some good action sequences here and there, but not all the way having a large impact as a film as a whole. And at number 10, we have Deadpool and Wolverine, one that just not click well with me. It is really sitting right in the middle of a mixed bag. It has its great moments, some great action, and some fun fan service and cameos all about the way. It has a heart to its message, but ultimately there's this other side where it just does not click well with the humor. The comedy can be a very hit or miss, mostly miss for me. And unfortunately, the way they go about the character arc for Deadpool and also for Wolverine just does not hit home with the impact that you're expecting. And so what we get out of Deadpool's character, it almost becomes unlikable because they're trying to balance in so many jokes that some can work, but the nature of his character is not as appealing to me within this film as it started with Tim Miller as the director. And so just the writing is all over the place. Certain things don't feel as developed or fleshed out. What you do with all these extra fun characters, while it is a love letter to the end of the Fox franchise coming from 20th Century Fox, ultimately it doesn't overly perform for what they're doing, for all of its ideas, all of its antics. And while I expected a little bit more out of it, I didn't expect a large scale thing that would have 100 cameos. Ultimately, there's still those disappointments that go along the way where it wasn't as fun or exciting by the fights that ultimately don't deliver a home run at the end of the day. And at number 9, we have X2. This is an interesting one, just going as a sequel, and it becomes compelling by the nature of what it's setting up and how you're dividing in these characters into different groups, but doesn't follow a direct storyline, so it feels a little off, taking in some new mutants, but not feeling all the way fleshed out by the nature of the flow of the story, and also knowing the end gets subverted in the very next film also loses the height of the experience for what you get from the emotional ride the first time, but upon rewatch, it becomes less and less compelling by how you're following. And while you're getting some interesting ideas for Logan trying to find his path, it ultimately uncovers itself to have too many subplots that don't have all the great impacts that it ought to have by the way it flows out the nature of all of its different stories, and never really personally affected me as much as some others. Next up, we have Deadpool 2, which is fun for the nature of how it is diving into time travel, certain aspects here and there that's building Josh Brolin as Cable. That is a fun performance, and Deadpool once again brings about a great level of comedy that blends in well with all the drama. There are certain things that are going a little too over the top. It's dividing certain things into different mannerisms of the characters that aren't as always compelling, but the nature of how it dives into this X-Force and what they're doing, there's a little bit of a build-up that sort of breaks up the structure of the plot from Act 1 and Act 2, but also having the beginning of the X-Force placed right in the middle of that just sort of underdevelops my expectations, and what we're getting out of the entertainment aspects sort of undergoing some different subversion when you're getting the time travel aspect, and the villain himself not always having the biggest means to an end with what his motivation is, and not performing as effectively for the nature of how certain ideas really could be performing that much greater. And at number 7, we have X-Men Days of Future Past. Now, I enjoy the ideas, what you're doing with the time travel in this one, but certain ideas with the future and how we're setting things up within that, before we go to the past, sort of undergoes the stakes that are going on, because you know certain things are going to turn out in a certain way, rather than leaving it a mystery, changing the tides of how things work out. And while there is a huge threat that is the Sentinels, there's things of how it's broken up from this structure in the future that is present day of then, and then also in the past, where you're going about all these political errors that creates an intriguing story on its own feet, but the divide and flow of the plot just hasn't been always as enticing to me, feeling a little overrated by the nature of what you're getting out of the story out of whole. Getting some characters that builds upon the compelling nature of them, but you've also seen a lot of it before, and so when you're getting into this one, doesn't feel as surprising, or the nature of where it is heading doesn't have the impact that I think it should be doing for the nature of what it's doing with the flow of the story, and how you're getting X-Men and Wolverine, and how he has to save everyone. And even amidst its contradictions, while I see the film has some good merits, some good themes, that develops the story along the way, it just doesn't ultimately win my heart over with the way that it all flows out and packages itself as a whole. And at number 6, we have the Wolverine. Now this is fun, just going into Japan, just having Wolverine be great for the nature of him, Hugh Jackman developing himself more and more, getting more fit, and the antics that you're getting with all these different mutants, that's untraditional for the nature of having to save someone that isn't a mutant, and not having the whole X-Force or X-Men force within the story. And so it goes about a different manner of the plot, how you're going about things along the run. It's a little bit of a slog in the middle, and there's certain ideas with the Poison Lady that I'm just not quite as fan of how she looks, or the way that it really kind of turns you off with the character that's divided within it, even if it's comic accurate or accurate to what they're interpreting. It just isn't a pleasing time with that. But the samurai ideas, the look at Wolverine going into a really high stake manner, it just becomes so grand for what you're doing with the fights, becoming creative with the nature of how it all flows out, not always having mutants versus mutants, or mutants first in all the guns. It's sort of a older style medieval type of sword fighting, where Wolverine takes on different katanas or swordsmen, that goes about a different fashion, takes on this interesting culture that doesn't go all the way trying to teach you something about Japan or anything, but goes in with the proper modesty of it, understanding the culture, and being able to sort of give a little nod, some teachings along the way that makes me appreciate the film that much more as a major in intercultural studies. And at number 5, we have X-Men. Now this is just a simple fun film that, even though I only watched these films for the first time in 2018, when I was 18, it still managed to grab it myself in from the beginning. And there's a special place for the early 2000s superhero films that just have a place in my heart, that I adore for the nature of the comic aspect, the comedy that feels different, but also has this dark undertone that builds upon its drama, but it has a light side note for building upon the nature of this. And I feel X-Men has the best blend of them, of having this comical aspect and this drama, and blending that all together to have some fun jokes, banter between Wolverine and this Cyclops, and how you're introducing these characters for the first time becomes compelling, has some great castings that are very underrated for the nature of what they have, that unfortunately haven't been as great with the writing that blends in later on. Bryan Singer is great for the director. What he brings to the table is fun and down to earth. It has higher stakes to some scale that isn't huge, and the Statue of Liberty battle is just iconic for the nature of what I can recall from it. Being able to understand all these characters, and getting Rogue as a simple girl that the villain wants, and how you're understanding all of these mutants through that, while also establishing these themes of how the humans are judging the mutants, and what all that turns into the tide of the mutants that are for the humans and the mutants that are against the humans, and what that all plays out, understanding the judgments that are going on screen by the discriminations that all this films and the films after sort of have to go about teaching as a whole, becomes clever and fun. And while there is some witty jokes that aren't going about a home run, it can be fun to just make fun of, even if there's certain jokes that aren't so clever, but some that just could go about a silly way of having a great time with this film as a whole. And at number 4, we have Deadpool, the first one that's so mature but smart in the way it cleverly crafts its humor. Tim Miller is great as a director for how he pulls off the action, pulling off some great stunts that pulls in things for the first time for the Deadpool character, by also creating an R-rated space for it to go off the rails with its crass humor, its crude jokes, and what you're doing with certain characters along the way, building the X-Force, creating Colossus, and providing some X-Men cameos that is so subtle but done quite well, is clever within the nature of how Deadpool is as a character, creating this lively environment that is fun, it's smart, it has the fourth wall breaking that is at its best, and the action that flows about along the way is so well crafted for the nature of how it sucks me into this story, convinces me that Deadpool is a great character as he is. And so unfortunately, while the rest of the franchise, for me personally, hasn't been as effective for making me love the Deadpool character and his humor as a whole, this one really pulls in the right punches for the notes that the Deadpool character has to pull off. And at number 3, we have X-Men Origins Wolverine. Yes, the hottest take possibly of this list that I just really appreciate everything that Gavin Hood brings as a director. Yes, it certainly isn't comic book accurate. Certainly there's some things that really take a bad turn. If you're looking at the bad taste in your mouth, that is the merc without a mouth, what they do with Deadpool is completely wrongdoing. But for me, having went into these films, I still remember not caring at all and not knowing about these characters. I don't read the comics, but even still, time and time again, having rewatched this one the most times, I still have a good amount of fun with it. The CGI isn't great, but the story is compelling enough that that part doesn't matter. The aspect of Wolverine going off, living his fight within the war, but then betraying and leaving the group that is sort of part of the X-Men before there was X-Men, goes about a different approach that becomes compelling by his relationship with getting a wife, becoming his own hermit type of character, similar to Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. But what they do with that becomes clever in the way it crafts its motivation within each of the characters, creating a great dynamic between certain characters that don't look like you're trying to be comic accurate, but still having a grand amount of time with the action it pulls off. And one of the most compelling story arcs for me personally is Wolverine finding his origin story, and how that plays out is just something that I can really soak in, watch any day of the week, and be able to appreciate certain marks that it does, even if it is not really trying to be the proper X-Men film that it probably should be. It still wins my heart over, but in the nature of how it compels the story forward, creates some action shots that are just kind of ridiculous, but fun for the nature of what they're pulling off with, and the themes that it's going about with the film, the nature of the poetry or the dialogue as a whole, just pulls me in from beginning to end. And while it does have those bad remarks, it never really affects me by the end of the day. And our runner-up is X-Men First Class. Now this is extra special, being the first of the younger sort of mutants look at a younger Charles Xavier and Magneto, and what we get out of James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender in their respective roles are just excellent in the exploration of how they establish this new foundation called the X-Men, while also building upon the villainous side of Magneto, creates all the character tropes that is well fitting, while also having well established creationship and building upon the origin to certain quirks about them, or the Cerebro, or certain ideas along the way, creates an idea and look into certain backgrounds before we had all the film loving community from the characters that we just once had from X-Men, the first trilogy, and putting them into this younger world and creating a great environment that goes about the training in lots of great ways, creating a different and colorful cast of mutants with different powers, while also still having a similar threat that's going after them, because they're more of the first time becoming mutants and discovering the mutant powers for the first time, and how the world responds to that becomes creative and clever by the nature of how everything is set up. The setting is colorful enough to have some great cinematography and building upon some great battles along the way from the beginning, and also a great ending battle that sets up some great antics, and having Azazel being a great villain as the mutant on his own, and creating the size that really holds this high stakes to the film that really livens up the environment of the X-Men films. And that leaves at number 1, Logan. Now James Mangold really expertly crafts this script, and what all pulls off for Logan, for the love of Wolverine, is just a love letter as well. It's built up with great stakes, great emotion, and how you build upon Logan with now that he's aged up and there's not many mutants up, what we get from him, and then this older Charles Xavier becomes compelling by the nature of it being a darker story, it having this R rating that doesn't hold back on the blood or the gore, the nature of what you can get out of the fights before, and having Caliban being his own character, and having this interesting threat that is an opposing side of the Wolverine, a duplicate if you will, that creates this great environment, this dark tale that really hones in on the emotions, builds up some nice communities, some great themes along the way, and how you get X-23 added into the mix, a younger daughter of Logan, just creates this great environment that I love, not only just as a great X-Men film, but as a film on its own. It really establishes things that are outside of the superhero genre, and balancing in on some action, on some drama, and being lighthearted, having the great notes that also establishes and blends into the drama-filled moments that really blends in the mixture well, and really hones in on the emotions by the end of the day, making it my number X-Men film of all time. So that's just my ranking of the X-Men movies from my least favorite to my favorite. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank them, and do you like the franchise as a whole, or do you not connect to the X-Men movies as effectively as a whole? So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.